Hi, everyone. This is part two of a brief history of U.S. foreign policy. So we're going to pick up where we left off in part one, which was the beginning of the Second World War. As you can tell, this is a very rapid history. Again, this draws on the chapter two of your textbook, so you should be reviewing your textbook for more detail. So read the textbook first, and then you can follow along with the lecture points. So we're going to get to the Second World War. Of course, again, I don't really go into either of the world wars in very much depth. I mainly think of them as markers, as big transition times for the United States, particularly with how the power relationships and the geopolitical relationships have shifted and changed because of these wars, and it really changes the power of the United States. So we're going to look at it from that perspective. I think also both of these wars, particularly World War II, which we'll talk about in a minute, really harbor certain feelings and ideas and beliefs about the United States that continue on to this day. So the Second World War starts off much like the First World War in that the U.S. is very reluctant to get involved. Of course, Hitler has been on the rise since the early 30s in Germany, as I mentioned before, because of the big hole that's left after they lose the war in World War I, and they're struck with all these reparations. They have to pay taxes and money to the victors of World War I. And they're really forced into economic turmoil. And because of this, it sort of opens up a vacuum, a power vacuum, for a very strong leader to come in and to use economic discontent to fuel sort of this ideological rage. So Hitler's been on the rise really throughout the 30s, and it really becomes evident that there's going to be a war. So the United States is hesitant to get in when World War II begins in the late 30s, and they wait it out, basically. They kind of stay on the sidelines and really go more towards a isolationist mode. But of course, once Japan, as you know, attacks Pearl Harbor, that changes everything. It's an attack, really a surprise attack on U.S. territory that the U.S. wasn't expecting. And because of that, that launches the U.S. into the Second World War. So then they get involved against Japan and then, of course, Germany. So in many ways, World War II comes about reluctantly for the United States. But and I'm again skipping over World War II, which is a huge thing, and I don't mean to minimize it, but we're not have time to get into World War history here. But it ends in 1945 with this victory, and I really want to talk about this moment of change when World War II is coming to an end, because that really sets the stage for modern history of the United States, which is it propels the U.S. into ultimately a great power position with the Soviet Union. That is the outcome that we'll focus on for our history when it comes to World War II. So the victors are the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, and together they defeat Germany by 1945. But actually in 1944, those three countries are already preparing for the victory. They know the victory is going to come, and they want to set up institutions to start to think about an international order that can set the stage for security and stability at the end of the war. This is what they learned from the interwar period, which was that was an economic disaster. They don't want that to happen again. So they want to think about how can they prevent another economic crisis, such as the one that followed World War I, with the Great Depression and a worldwide depression, and what can they put in place to kind of prevent that from happening. So Roosevelt actually dies near the end of the war, and President Truman assumes office after his death. And of course, the war comes to a dramatic end when the United States actually drops two nuclear bombs on Japan. Okay, so I want to think about how did World War II shape U.S. foreign relations, and what lessons are drawn? What lessons are drawn from World War II? Oops, there we go. Let's see if I can just do it that way. Go. And the other thing I want to think about is how has the event of World War II been used and deployed in more modern history of the United States? I think we can think of, in fact, after September 11th, for example, there were many comparisons to the Pearl Harbor bombings as sort of launching a world war. I mean, granted, we didn't officially enter a world war after September 11th, but we did in terms of a war on terrorism that is still ongoing and used if to justify all kinds of actions around the world. So I think that also the issue of World War II and the heroism, the kind of the romanticism of World War II is also harkened back to as a unique moment in U.S. history. So let's first think about what lessons are drawn. I think the most important lessons that are drawn after the World War II is really from the interwar period. So it's not necessarily drawn from World War II itself, but it's also drawn from the interwar period, which is that they want to avoid this outcome of financial fallout. And also, they don't want to prevent another rise of Hitler. They don't want to have another Hitler situation. So they need to think about how can they promote peace in a way that both shores up those that have lost the war as well as those that have won the war. I also think that World War II is often thought back as a very, for good reason, as a just war, as a war that was completely justified, it sort of harkens back to this idea of the U.S. as a savior, as a moral victory. So there's that component of it. However, there's also sort of the contradictory element to it, which is that the U.S. won the war by dropping two nuclear bombs on civilians after firebombing Japan as well, and killing over 150,000 civilians in one night. So, what is the moral imperative there? That's also another issue that I think is raised by World War II. In fact, that's the only time that any nuclear weapon has ever been used was by the United States at the end of this war. And in fact, the response of the world community was that this was such a horrific weapon that it could never be used, although maybe sought after and held, but never used. So that also is something to consider. Okay, whoops. Okay, so what happens then at the end of World War II? You really get this emergence of two superpowers and into a global state of bipolarity. So the Soviet Union and the US are left with a devastated Europe, a Europe that has, to completely rebuild. And that at first it seems as though the Soviet Union and the United States might be able to work together because they obviously were allies during World War II. And the United States even proposes to the Soviet Union they should join some of the geopolitical institutions that the U.S. are hatching at the end of World War II. One of the things that comes out of it is that the Soviet Union has no interest in joining the institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank and GATT, which comes a little bit later, but the GATT is what is the preliminary WTO. We think of the WTO today. So some of the main institutions that the U.S. designs at the end of World War II are these financial institutions to try to prevent a global economic meltdown, basically. So they set up the World Bank, which is really involved with money from the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe. And the main impetus for rebuilding Europe is not just to help our friends, but also to rebuild a buying community, a place where we can export goods to, and trading partners after recognizing that at the end of World War I, there was no one to trade with because the economy was basically shut down. So the World Bank is designed is really originally called the Bank of Reconstruction, geared towards Europe. Then you get the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is designed to lend money to those that are in economic crisis for short-term loans to help them in their economy. So these are the kind of the financial institutions that are put in place after World War II. When the Soviet Union refuses to join them, because of course they're capitalist institutions, and the Soviet Union is becoming a communist country and is very anti-capitalist, obviously, then the U.S. kind of starts to wonder why. What's going on in the Soviet Union that they're not joining in? So this leads to an investigation in terms of like what's happening with their strategy. And right away, by 1947, you get a divergence where you recognize that the Soviet Union is going down this communist, anti-capitalist path, and it's in direct confrontation to the United States. So rather than a peaceful time, which it looks like might occur after the end of World War II, you see immediately this world of bipolarity, of antagonism between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Because one of the other institutions that the U.S., of course, establishes at the end of World War II is the United Nations, which is this building nations idea of President Wilson to kind of think about a global peace environment where states can work through diplomacy to war, amongst other things, like solve other kinds of problems. So the United States develops a containment strategy this comes off of a telegram that's sent actually back to the United States from a diplomat who's later revealed to be George Kennan, who's discussing why the Soviet Union refuses to join the IMF and the World Bank as partners. And he basically says that their capitalism is the antithesis to communism, and that they see themselves as in a long struggle against capitalism. And this is a direct confrontation to the United States. And not only that, but they're spreading a communist message to other countries around the world, and that this is a threat to what the U.S. envisions, which is a free market system and a democratic system. So the U.S. just developed something called containment, right? This is eventually becomes the Truman Doctrine. Containment strategy, which is to contain communist expansion into any areas or any countries except those that are already existing, and to sort of check and balance Soviet power wherever it's starting to emerge. So the United States uses this strategy of containment to strengthen their political, economic, and military ties overseas, and to think about a worldwide strategy towards balancing against the Soviet Union. Okay, so we talked a little bit about some of the international institutions that were started after World War II, in part by the United States and Great Britain. Those are the primary actors, but of course there's other powers that join them right away. But the other thing that changes is internal changes within the United States that are significant. So some of the institutional reforms within the United States, within the domestic government structures of the United States, is that the security and national defense. In 1947, Congress passes the National Security Act, which remakes the way the U.S. Deals with security. Because we have the War Department, which is a department that comes together at times of war, but it was thought of as sort of dissolve in times of peace. But the National Security Act of 1947 creates a permanent defense structure, which means, of course, think about changing the word from war to defense. Defense is something that you always have. War is something you may or may not be in. So it's thought of as more permanent. Defense is a permanent state. So they create the Department of Defense, which oversees the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. They also create the National Security Council, which is within the White House. It's also an ad hoc advisor group that is handpicked by the president to inform him on national security issues and also to coordinate information and intelligence coming from the different agencies. And they also create the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which did not exist before 1947. They had the Secret Service department. So there are these struggles that sort of come from this restructuring between organizations for resources and power. But you really get a remaking of the United States foreign policy, a move really from the State Department, where a lot of the power for U.S. foreign policy is housed before World War II, to the Defense Department. I mean, today, arguably, the Defense Department has a big, but as we'll see later on, a huge budget compared to the State Department. But before World War II, the State Department was really the arm of U.S. foreign policy, and now we've seen that shift. You also see a global shift in terms of how the U.S. views its power. Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay with PowerPoint for some reason. Okay, here we go. So as I mentioned, you see this in institutional reforms on the global scale, which is the United States also creates these transnational organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, as I also mentioned, and then GATT eventually in 1947, which is to govern trade and to reduce tariffs. And you also see that they developed NATO, which is a collective security agreement with Europe, and that is a direct response to Soviet expansion and this belief that a European country that's in NATO is attacked. Of course, the United States will come to its aid, so that's a huge security agreement that still exists today. And then, of course, the Marshall Plan, which I mentioned, which is to give economic aid for European countries to help them rebuild. So you have a vision, really, of that's beyond just U.S. recovery. It's even beyond European recovery. Worldwide vision that extends U.S. power. It's not only orchestrated by the United States, but primarily orchestrated by the United States and Great Britain to form a Western ideologically based political order and international order, sometimes called the liberal international economic order, which liberal meaning free, like free trade, economic, or well, like that sort of liberal with a capital L, economic order that extends worldwide. So they're constructing a vision of their stemming really from their own national identity, but looking at it from a geopolitical perspective. So this is a complete transformation of the United States into a global power. Okay, so after you have this creation of a liberal international economic, of course, you have this bipolar world, and you don't get direct conflicts between the Soviet Union and the United States. You get some flare-ups, but you don't get direct conflicts. There's no war between the two countries, but you get what's called something's called hotspots in the Cold War, right? It's called the direct conflict. So hotspots, meaning that all of the wars that take place in until the end of the Cold War are really relationship to the U.S. and the Soviet Union, right? But you still get war. It's just that they're not direct confrontations with Soviet Union. So you get the Korean War, which has to do with the divide between North Korea and South Korea, and the of the North Korean sort of communist leanings, right? Support from China. Again, there's no clear victory, and the country's divided. This sets precedents for future conflicts. Have an all-out victory. We think of other conflicts like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which ends up with an embargo to Cuba that's ongoing. You have Vietnam, which ends with no real clear, I guess, a loss on the part of the United States. A very messy war that's drawn out that isn't as clear cut as some of the past wars like World War I and World War II. So this really sets a precedent. There are going to be flare-ups. There are going to sort of be secularly fought directly between the Soviet Union and the United States, but reflecting this ideological conflict over capitalism and communism. So Cuba is another example. So one of the significance of Cuba in the 1960s is that the Cuban Missile Crisis is a very interesting historical event, and actually there's a good section in your textbook on this, which is, of course, that the U.S. discovers that there's potentially nuclear missiles being in Cuba. Cuba is solely by the Soviet Union and the team of Castro in the 60s. He's the new president of the United States at the time, and they're able to sort of stave off an actual direct conflict, a missile coming from Cuba to the United States that was launched on the part of the Union by having deliberations and discussions and ultimately an embargo against the Soviet Union that prevents further in developing those nuclear launchers, basically. And because of this, there's a peaceful end to this crisis. But of course, it leads to a long-standing embargo that looks like it may actually be coming to an end under today, in this period, after all those years since the 1960s. So this really leads to an ongoing long embargo against Cuba. But the interesting thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, is that it represents actually good foreign policy decision-making in that it didn't result in a war. And this was the closest that the United States ever came to direct conflict with the Soviet Union. It's also right off the coast of the United States and Florida. And of course, there's several things that led up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, including the Bay of Pigs invasion that happens in 1961, that was initiated when JFK was first became president and fails. It was designed to try to topple the Castro regime. And then, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs after that. And then you have Vietnam. So Vietnam is also sparked because of this Cold War conflict, and also the belief on the part of the United States that communist countries would start to fall like dominoes, and that one communist regime like Cuba was similar to Angola, was similar to the Soviet Union, was similar to Vietnam, and China. So you got the lumping of all of the versions of communism as being exactly the same thing, and that as one fell, another would fall, another would fall. So that's what the domino theory is thought to be. This was later on recognized to be so flawed in truth, and a very dominant analogy that led to lots of intervention on the part of the United States, including getting involved with Vietnam. During Vietnam, you'll learn more about actually both the Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam War during a movie that we'll be watching later on in the session called Fog of War that goes into this history in a little bit more depth than we do here. Of course, Vietnam is such a significant war for the United States because it really represents a different, actually over a period from the 60s into the early 70s of really a rise and then a wane of U.S. power. So you get the United States in the early 60s sending in advisors, even under JFK, and then Eisenhower continues sending in advisors into Vietnam to try to stave off the North Vietnamese army. And eventually, of course, leading to troop deployments and loss of almost 60,000 U.S. soldiers. And of course, sort of public opinion rising in support of Vietnam and then falling dramatically in 1968 when you get incredible backlash to U.S. foreign policy and heavy protests, social movements against the war, media turns against the United States in many ways in terms of, I shouldn't say against the United States, but starts to showcase the front lines of what's happening on the war and the brutality of what's going on over there, and the fact that it's an unwinnable war. You have guerrilla warfare on the part of the Vietnamese, and the U.S. is very unprepared to sort of win in this war. You also see things like the Nixon administration, which is a very corrupt administration and is lying about the ability of the United States to win this war, and that's revealed in the Pentagon Papers in the 70s. And you get something called the Vietnam Syndrome, which is the belief that any war that does not have a clear end can lead to something called a quagmire, which is basically like a mush pit where you cannot get out of. So eventually the United States withdraws its forces, and you get the South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam, and it's considered a loss on the part of the United States. This is really a low point when it comes to U.S. power. So some of the major lessons of the Vietnam War are that I think a couple things. One is that analogies such as like the domino theory can really lead to bad decision making on the part of policymakers. Another lesson on the part of the U.S. government was that open media access can really defeat their goals. In other words, by allowing reporters to get on the front lines of Vietnam and to, in uncensored ways, send back video. It was the first real television war in the United States living rooms, and what was uncensored led to big problems for the United States government from being able to facilitate the war because the people started to rise up against it. And so you had unprecedented access on the part of media to what was going on over there. You also saw that without a clear ending and sort of this sort of escalating quagmire that went on, it really led to a backlash in public opinion. So this is also thought of as something that the U.S. should just not do. And really after this, the influence on U.S. foreign policy was the hesitancy to getting involved in any foreign wars, particularly that were far away, that there was really a clear goal as to why the U.S. was fighting over there. That also the U.S. instituted the draft. I mean, can you imagine having a draft where all of a sudden you were about to go to college and then you're heading off to Vietnam? So that was also a huge lesson. Was instituting the draft led to big backlash and the big loss of casualties. I mean, 50,000 or more, young people killed is a big loss for the United States. It's unprecedented now to imagine 50,000 soldiers killed. In Iraq, for example, that would have just been unheard of. So that one of the lessons learned from how to fight wars in the future were that they needed to be short, they needed to have a clear ending, and you needed to really minimize media access and loss of life. So eventually, after Vietnam, we get to the end of the Cold War. Of course, leaping through history here. You get both a detente that starts out in the 70s and then easings of tensions between the United States, Soviet Union, and China. You have Carter, who's really visioning an internationalist foreign policy, focusing on democratization. But you also get other kinds of flare-ups throughout the 70s, both Marxist revolutions in Latin America, also the Iran hostage crisis in the 80s, or in the 70s, and then eventually leading to the end of the Carter administration, because he simply cannot get the hostages back. So that's happening in the late 70s, sorry. And then you get Ronald Reagan coming into power, which is a huge development for the United States. It's really coming off of sort of a low point in power after the Carter administration. And moreover, interestingly, even though Reagan's a staunch anti-communist and sort of a bold black and white thinker in some ways, he also is willing to work with Gorbachev and negotiate with the Soviet Union. He initiates both a massive defense spending and technological buildup that kind of forces the Soviet Union to try to play catch up, and therefore it damages their economy. But he also is willing to talk with them and negotiate. And because of that relationship between Gorbachev and Reagan, they're able in some ways to negotiate and lead to easing that eventually leads to the fallout economically in the Soviet Union and the dissolving of the Soviet bloc. So in many ways, it fails because of economic reasons, but also, of course, political uprising on the part of the people. And Bush Sr. Adapts a strategy of supporting Gorbachev and leading to this sort of soft landing and collapse rather than a hard fall and then punishment to avoid any military conflict that might come after that. So under Bush Sr., you get then a totally new world order. It's hard to imagine now because in a way, it's hard to look back and think about bipolarity. But you have a bipolar world going on for decades. And the Soviet Union is sort of always that antagonist there. So all of a sudden, you have a war, the Cold War ends, and you have a unipolar, what's sometimes called the unipolar moment, but unipolarity, which means one power is an absolute hegemon, which is the United States. And there's really no other power that can match it. So it's really a moment of new world order. And this is envisioned by the first President Bush, which is one of internationalism, of not necessarily multipolarity, but a global power that's using multinational institutions, and especially one where democracy is going to reign free. In other words, with the communism ending, it's thought of as sort of a triumph of democratic regimes, and that you start to see new democracies developing, even in the old Soviet states. So it really sees this triumphant end of history, is sometimes called, as Francis Fukuyama states in 1989, that history has ended, which basically means the old history has ended and a new one has emerged, which is the inevitability of democracy and liberalism, economic liberalism, and the triumph of capitalism. However, despite this sort of global triumph and this vision of a new unipolar world of peace, you immediately start to see that actually there's going to be different kinds of conflicts, not the same conflicts you had under the bipolar world, but new conflicts, particularly ethnic conflicts emerge, and states start to fall apart. So in many ways, the bipolar system held together many states, and once that evaporates, you see the push for all kinds of new states. I mean, one of the first areas, of course, is the old Soviet Union, where new states emerge there. You also see states falling apart like Yugoslavia and other places in Europe, where states want Kosovo, they want their own identity, right? And you see ethnic conflict between these countries. So the New World Order and the new strategies really fail to prevent these kinds of military conflicts from emerging. So we're ending here with really the Bush Sr. before we get into the more recent history of Iraq, first Gulf War, Iraq, the Clinton administration, and 9/11, which we'll be taking up a little bit with the 9/11 Commission report. So we really see a transformation from this sort of vision of a new world order to one where there's all different kinds of conflicts that are really unprecedented and unexpected. I think we, of course, see this after September 11th, where you then, of course, see a change towards thinking about terrorism and cells and non-state actors as real threats. So you really go from a point of bipolarity to one where there's a lot of emerging states and transitions to democracy that creates different kinds of conflicts, to a situation where there's a reign really of global economic development and democracy promotion that's happening during the Clinton administration, where you see globalization reigning, and then of course you get George Bush, which after his first year in office, you have September 11th and a real change after 9/11. So this is a really rapid history to sort of bring you up to speed, but it's also designed to help you remember some of your high school history here, to think about some of these key moments of history and how they've imprinted on U.S. foreign policy and change, particularly the U.S. role in the world and U.S. power relationships in the world. Of course, there's a lot left out here, but it's designed to get you caught up and ready for the next segments of the session. Thank you.